The first time I realized my grandson was afraid to breathe too loudly in his own house, I stopped feeling like a welcome guest and started feeling like a witness. I remember standing in Jennifer's kitchen on a rainy Sunday afternoon, holding a grocery bag full of things Ethan used to love when he was little. Chocolate chip cookies from the bakery near my church, a small carton of mint chocolate chip ice cream, and one of those little dinosaur puzzles he'd been obsessed with a year earlier. The house smelled like lemon cleaner so strongly it almost burned my nose, and every surface looked untouched, like nobody actually lived there. Jennifer liked things perfect. Perfect counters. Perfect schedules. Perfect children. Ethan sat at the dining table with his shoulders stiff while he worked on math homework. He was only 10 years old, but the way he glanced toward the hallway every few seconds reminded me of someone waiting for permission to exist. "Grandma," he whispered when he saw me. Just that one word sounded relieved. Jennifer walked into the kitchen carrying her tablet. "Ethan, what's rule number 4? She asked without even looking at him. He froze immediately. "No snacks before dinner," he answered quietly. "And," she pressed, "and no interruptions during study time." Jennifer nodded once like he'd passed an inspection instead of answered his mother. Then she looked at me and forced a smile so tight it barely moved her lips. "We've been working on structure lately," she said. "Children need consistency." I smiled back because arguing never helped. Of course. But then I noticed something hanging on the refrigerator door. A white dry erase board titled Family Compliance Rules written in thick black marker. Underneath were numbered rules in Jennifer's handwriting. No sugar after 4 p.m. No backtalk. No electronics during meals. No private conversations that exclude family members. That last one made my stomach tighten. Ethan looked toward the board before speaking again, almost like he was checking whether he was allowed to talk. "Grandma, did you still bring the puzzle?" he asked carefully. Jennifer answered before I could. "Homework first. Rewards later." The boy's face dropped so fast it hurt to watch. David was upstairs on a work call, which meant Jennifer controlled the entire emotional temperature of the house. And everyone knew it. I sat beside Ethan and watched him erase the same math problem 3 times because his hands were shaking. When I quietly told him he was doing fine, he looked at me with this strange expression children get when kindness surprises them. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Because children don't look grateful for basic warmth unless warmth has become rare. The following Wednesday, Jennifer called me at exactly 3:15 in the afternoon and asked if I could pick Ethan up from school because she had a dentist appointment across town. Her voice sounded overly cheerful in the careful way people sound when they are trying to prove they are perfectly calm. I said yes immediately because any extra hour with my grandson felt precious lately. Ethan climbed into my car carrying a backpack that looked too heavy for his thin shoulders. The second he shut the passenger door, he let out a long breath like he had finally stepped outside after being underwater. "Can we go straight home?" I asked gently. He stared out the window for a moment before speaking. "Could we maybe get ice cream first? Just for a little while." I smiled. "I think we can manage that." His entire face brightened so suddenly that it almost broke my heart. We drove to a small family-owned ice cream shop about 10 minutes away. The kind with faded red booths and a bell over the door that jingled every time someone walked in. Ethan ordered mint chocolate chip in a waffle cone, then immediately looked nervous after saying it out loud. "Is that okay?" he asked quietly. "Of course it is," I said. "You are allowed to enjoy ice cream without requesting legal approval." He laughed at that. A real laugh. Not the polite little sound he made around his mother. We sat near the window while rain tapped softly against the glass outside. Ethan started talking more in 20 minutes than he had during the last 3 family dinners combined. He told me about a boy at school who got suspended for putting a frog in a locker. He told me he hated broccoli casserole. He told me he wished Saturdays lasted longer. Small things. Normal things. Then halfway through his cone, a drop of melted ice cream landed on the front of his sweatshirt. His entire body stiffened instantly. "Oh no," he whispered, grabbing napkins so quickly he nearly knocked over his water cup. "It is okay," I told him. "It is just ice cream." But Ethan was already scrubbing at the stain with panic in his eyes. "Mom gets upset when I ruin clothes." "Sweetheart, this is washable." He kept rubbing the fabric anyway. She says people who are careless become failures when they grow up. I stopped moving for a second after he said that. Outside, a pickup truck rolled through the wet parking lot, while an American flag snapped in the wind near the gas station across the street. Everything looked so painfully ordinary. And yet this little boy sat in front of me acting like spilled ice cream was a personal disaster. On the drive back, Ethan became quiet again the closer we got to home. Right before we turned onto his street, he looked at me carefully and asked, "Grandma, do you think somebody can love you and still make you nervous all the time?" That question stayed with me the entire night. I sat in my living room with the television on low volume, staring at an old framed photo of David at 10 years old holding a fishing rod almost taller than he was. Back then, children laughed loudly without apologizing for it. They spilled juice on carpets. They tracked mud through kitchens. They forgot homework and survived anyway. I kept hearing Ethan's small voice asking if love was supposed to make you nervous. The next Sunday, I came over earlier than usual to help with dinner. Jennifer was standing at the kitchen counter cutting vegetables into perfect little squares, while classical music played softly from a speaker near the sink. Everything in her house always felt staged. Like a model home, nobody was allowed to truly relax inside. Ethan sat at the table doing homework again, except this time he barely looked up when I walked in. "Hi, Grandma," he said automatically, without the warmth from the ice cream shop. Jennifer noticed me, glancing toward him. "He lost television privileges for 3 days," she explained calmly. "Apparently we have started developing attitude problems lately." Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. "I was not having an attitude," he muttered under his breath. Jennifer stopped chopping vegetables. The entire kitchen seemed to freeze with her. "Excuse me?" she asked quietly. Ethan swallowed hard but did not answer. David walked in right then carrying grocery bags from the garage. "Everything okay?" he asked, already sounding tired. Jennifer gave a little laugh that did not reach her eyes. "Apparently your son thinks rules are optional now." David sighed and rubbed his forehead. "Ethan, just listen to your mother, buddy." It happened so quickly after that. Ethan pushed his pencil down onto the table harder than he meant to. "I do listen," he snapped. "All the time." Silence crashed over the room. Jennifer slowly turned toward him. "Where exactly is this coming from?" Ethan looked terrified the second the words left his mouth, but something inside him had already cracked open. "You make everything into a rule," he blurted out. "I cannot even talk without worrying about getting in trouble." Jennifer stared at him in complete disbelief. Then her eyes shifted toward me. Not dramatic, not loud, just cold, calculating. "Interesting," she said softly. "He never used to talk like this." My stomach tightened instantly because I understood what she was implying before she even said it. David looked uncomfortable and started unloading groceries as loudly as possible to avoid the tension building in the room. Jennifer wiped her hands carefully with a kitchen towel and leaned against the counter. "You know," she said, still staring directly at me, "children become confused when too many adults undermine structure." "Jennifer," I said carefully, "I have never undermined you." She smiled then, but it was the kind of smile people use right before drawing blood without ever raising their voice. Maybe not intentionally. After dinner that night, I stayed longer than usual pretending to help clean the kitchen even though Jennifer clearly preferred doing everything herself. She moved around the room with controlled efficiency, loading the dishwasher in precise rows while soft jazz played from the speaker near the sink. Ethan had disappeared upstairs without asking to be excused, which normally would have triggered one of Jennifer's lectures about manners, but she seemed more interested in me now. David sat at the counter scrolling through emails on his phone, exhausted in the way middle-aged men often become when work and family problems start blending together. Nobody spoke for several minutes. Then Jennifer finally broke the silence without turning around. "I think Ethan is becoming emotionally dependent on outside validation." The sentence sounded rehearsed, almost clinical. David glanced up slowly. "What does that mean?" Jennifer dried a spotless plate with a towel before answering. "It means lately he only responds positively when someone makes him feel like rules are unnecessary." I felt the air in the kitchen change immediately. She still was not saying my name, but she did not have to. David rubbed the back of his neck. "Jen, he is 10. "Exactly," she replied. This is when boundaries matter most. I quietly folded a dish towel in my hands. Children also need room to relax. Jennifer gave a small laugh under her breath. Relaxation is not the same thing as lack of discipline. Then she finally looked directly at me. You let him eat ice cream on a school night, Margaret. I blinked once, surprised Ethan had apparently confessed an ice cream cone like it was criminal evidence. It was one scoop after school. And now suddenly he thinks rules are negotiable. David immediately stood up from his chair. The second tension became unavoidable. I am going to check something upstairs, he muttered before disappearing completely, leaving the two of us alone exactly as Jennifer intended. She waited until his footsteps faded before speaking again. I know you mean well, she said softly, but every time you step in and act like I am too strict, Ethan becomes harder to manage. I have never said you are a bad mother. You do not have to say it out loud. Her voice remained calm, which somehow made it worse. Children pick up on energy, on approval, on who makes them feel safe from consequences. I stared at her carefully then because suddenly everything made sense. Jennifer did not just want obedience from Ethan. She wanted emotional loyalty too. The next morning I called Ethan before school like I usually did on Thursdays. The phone rang twice before going to voicemail. 10 minutes later, I received a text message from Jennifer instead. From now on, mornings need to stay focused and distraction-free before school. Please avoid unnecessary calls during weekdays. Thank you for respecting our parenting structure. I read the message 3 times while sitting alone at my kitchen table beside a cold cup of coffee. It was polite enough that nobody else would think twice about it. But underneath every carefully chosen word was a warning. Jennifer had started building a wall around my grandson, and she wanted me to understand exactly who controlled the gate. Over the next 2 weeks, the distance between me and Ethan became painfully noticeable. Jennifer stopped asking me to pick him up from school. Sunday dinners became shorter and strangely formal, like business meetings where everyone was pretending not to notice the tension sitting at the center of the table. Ethan barely spoke anymore during meals. Every sentence sounded pre-approved before leaving his mouth. One Sunday afternoon, I arrived with homemade macaroni and cheese because it used to be his favorite comfort food during winter. Jennifer opened the front door, glanced at the casserole dish and gave me a tight smile. That is sweet, but we are limiting processed dairy this month. She took the dish anyway and set it on the counter without even removing the foil. During dinner, Ethan quietly reached for a second dinner roll. Jennifer noticed immediately. What is Rule 7? She asked. Ethan froze with his hand still halfway across the table. 1 serving of bread at dinner, he answered softly. Then why are you reaching for another? His cheeks turned red. I was still hungry. Jennifer folded her napkin carefully beside her plate. Being hungry does not mean ignoring structure. David kept eating without looking up. I watched Ethan slowly pull his hand back into his lap like he had done something shameful. A few minutes later, his elbow accidentally knocked over his water glass. The spill spread across the table toward Jennifer's phone. Ethan immediately jumped up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. I am sorry, he said quickly. I am really sorry. Jennifer closed her eyes for one long second before grabbing paper towels. You need to start paying attention to your actions before they affect other people. Nobody raised their voice. That was the unsettling part. Everything in that house sounded controlled, measured, polished. But underneath it lived constant tension, like everybody was trying not to trigger an invisible alarm. After dinner, I found Ethan sitting alone on the back porch steps wearing a Patriots hoodie 2 sizes too big for him. The air smelled like rain and fresh-cut grass from the neighbor's yard. He stared out at the dark backyard fence while hugging his knees to his chest. Hey, I said softly as I sat beside him. You okay? He shrugged without looking at me. I keep messing everything up. No, sweetheart. You are just being a kid. He shook his head immediately. Mom says excuses make weak people. Before I could answer, the back door slid open behind us. Jennifer stood there with her arms crossed loosely over her sweater. There you are, she said to Ethan. Then her eyes moved toward me. I think he needs a little less emotional rescuing and a little more accountability lately. Ethan lowered his head instantly. Jennifer held the door open and waited for him to come inside first. As he passed her, she rested a hand on his shoulder gently enough that no outsider would ever think twice about it. But I noticed Ethan tense underneath her touch. And for the first time in my life, I felt afraid of someone who never once needed to scream. 2 days later, Jennifer hosted a small birthday dinner for her younger sister Emily. It was one of those carefully planned suburban gatherings where everything looked beautiful enough for social media. Candles glowed along the dining table. A charcuterie board sat untouched beside bottles of sparkling water and white wine. Jennifer moved through the evening with polished perfection, smiling at guests while adjusting napkins and correcting tiny details nobody else even noticed. Ethan stayed unusually quiet most of the night. He sat beside me during dinner, barely touching the grilled chicken on his plate. Every few minutes Jennifer would glance toward him with the same watchful expression she used when checking whether the stove had been turned off. Halfway through dessert, Emily accidentally knocked her fork onto the floor and laughed at herself. "I swear I cannot get through one meal without dropping something," she joked. Everyone chuckled politely except Ethan. He looked genuinely confused. "You are not in trouble?" he asked before he could stop himself. The table went silent for half a second. Emily blinked. "For dropping a fork?" Ethan immediately looked down at his lap. Jennifer's smile tightened. "Ethan has been struggling with sarcasm lately," she said smoothly. Conversation resumed, but tension lingered underneath every word after that. About 20 minutes later, one of Emily's little girls spilled orange soda near the edge of the coffee table in the living room. The child gasped dramatically, but Emily simply grabbed napkins and laughed it off. "That is why God invented paper towels," she said. Ethan stared at the scene like he was witnessing something impossible. Then suddenly, before anyone could react, he spoke too loudly. Grandma would not get mad either. The room froze instantly. Jennifer slowly turned toward him from across the living room. "Excuse me." Ethan's face lost all color. "Nothing," he whispered. "No," Jennifer replied calmly. "Go ahead." Nobody moved. Even the children stopped talking. Ethan looked overwhelmed, trapped between fear and frustration. "I just meant Grandma does not make everything feel like a test all the time." The silence afterward felt physically painful. David stared down at his drink like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Emily awkwardly gathered empty cups from the coffee table, pretending not to hear anything. Jennifer stood completely still for several seconds before giving a short laugh that sounded almost amused. "Well," she said lightly, "that explains a lot." My stomach dropped immediately. "Jennifer," I began carefully, "he is upset." "No, Margaret," she interrupted, still using that terrifyingly controlled voice. "What he is influenced." Ethan looked close to tears now. "Mom, I did not mean. You have been disrespectful for weeks," Jennifer continued. "And suddenly you sound exactly like someone else." Then she looked directly at me in front of everyone gathered in that living room. "I think it is incredibly inappropriate when grandparents encourage children to question parental authority." Nobody defended me. Nobody defended Ethan either. David finally muttered, "Maybe everybody should calm down," but it was weak and far too late. Ethan stood up so abruptly that his chair bumped against the hardwood floor. "Grandma is the only person who talks to me like I am normal," he blurted out before rushing upstairs. And for the first time since all this started, Jennifer stopped pretending this was about parenting. The atmosphere changed completely after that birthday dinner. Not loudly, not dramatically. Jennifer was too controlled for dramatic scenes. Instead, everything became quieter, colder, more calculated. 3 days passed without a single call from Ethan. Then another 4. I finally texted David asking if everything was okay, and his response came nearly 2 hours later. "Things are tense right now. Jennifer thinks some space may help." I stared at those words while sitting in my parked car outside the grocery store. Some space. Like I was a bad influence instead of his grandmother. The following Sunday, for the first time in nearly 11 years, there was no family dinner invitation. Around 6 o'clock that evening, I finally gave in and drove past their neighborhood just to ease my own mind. Their dining room lights glowed warmly through the front windows. I could see shadows moving inside. They were eating together while I sat alone in my car holding 2 containers of chicken noodle soup I had made for Ethan because he used to love it whenever the weather turned cold. I did not even knock on the door. The next morning, I received another message from Jennifer. I think it would be healthier for Ethan if communication stayed limited for a while. He needs clarity and consistency right now. I noticed she never once used the words grandmother or family anymore. Only structure, consistency, boundaries. Terms that sounded reasonable enough to outsiders while quietly cutting emotional ties underneath them. About a week later, David stopped by my house unexpectedly after work. He looked exhausted, older somehow. His tie hung loose around his collar, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "Mom," he sighed as soon as he stepped inside. "Can you please just try to make this easier?" I stared at him in disbelief. Easier for who? He rubbed both hands over his face. Jennifer thinks Ethan is becoming defiant because he feels protected every time he pushes back against rules. Protected? I repeated softly. David, he is a child. I know that. His voice cracked with frustration. But every time something happens, he runs to you emotionally instead of dealing with consequences at home. I felt something painful settle in my chest then because suddenly I understood the real problem. Ethan trusted me too much, and Jennifer saw that trust as competition. Did you ever stop to ask why he feels safer with me? I asked quietly. David looked away immediately. Mom, please. I cannot do this tonight. Before leaving, he hesitated near the front door like he wanted to say something else. Jennifer found a drawing in Ethan's backpack, he admitted carefully. A drawing. It showed a little boy trapped inside a box. My stomach tightened instantly. And David swallowed hard. The mother figure in the picture looked angry. Ethan told Jennifer it was just imagination. Silence filled the room between us. Finally, I asked the question I already feared I knew the answer to. What did Jennifer say? David exhaled slowly. She thinks somebody has been putting ideas into his head. After he left, I sat alone in my living room listening to the old grandfather clock tick against the silence of the house. Outside, wind rattled dry autumn leaves across the sidewalk. Somewhere across town, my grandson was probably lying awake in that spotless bedroom trying to figure out whether love was supposed to feel comforting or exhausting. And I could not even call to tell him he was not crazy. 3 weeks passed without seeing Ethan in person. Thanksgiving was approaching, and the neighborhood had already started glowing with white string lights wrapped around mailboxes and porch railings. Every grocery store smelled like cinnamon candles and pumpkin pie, but none of it reached me emotionally that year. The silence from my son's house felt heavier than any argument could have. Then one rainy Thursday afternoon, my phone rang unexpectedly while I was folding laundry. David's name flashed across the screen. The second I answered, I heard stress in his breathing. Mom, he said quickly, have you heard from Ethan today? My stomach dropped immediately. No. Why? There was a pause filled with muffled voices in the background. He left school early after an incident with another student. I stood up so fast the basket of towels tipped onto the carpet. What kind of incident? Nothing violent, David said quickly. He just got overwhelmed during class and walked out after arguing with the teacher. My chest tightened painfully. Where is he now? Another pause. That is the problem. Nobody can find him. I grabbed my car keys without even realizing it. Rain hammered against the windshield as I drove through town with trembling hands. David kept calling every few minutes with updates that never actually updated anything. Jennifer had apparently searched the school parking lot twice. A police officer was driving around nearby neighborhoods. Ethan's phone was turned off because Jennifer only allowed him to use it during specific hours. Everything about the situation sounded absurdly controlled, even in the middle of panic. 40 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time David sounded different. Quieter. Mom, he said slowly. They found him. I pulled my car onto the side of the road immediately. Where? Silence filled the line for one long second. Your front porch. I looked through my windshield toward my own house sitting at the end of the street, less than half a mile away. The porch light glowed against the rain. And there, curled up in the old wooden porch swing beneath a blanket from my outdoor storage bench, sat Ethan. Soaked sneakers. Red eyes. tiny shoulders shaking from cold exhaustion. By the time I reached him, Jennifer's SUV and a police cruiser were already parked outside. Ethan looked up the second he saw me and immediately burst into tears he had clearly been holding back for hours. "I did not know where else to go," he whispered. Jennifer stood near the driveway gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles looked pale. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said sharply. "He runs here every time something happens." Ethan flinched at her voice instantly. The police officer exchanged an uncomfortable glance with David before quietly stepping away toward his car. David crouched beside his son carefully. "Buddy, why would you scare everybody like this?" Ethan wiped his face with the sleeve of his hoodie. "Because Grandma is the only place where I do not feel wrong all the time." Nobody spoke after that. Rainwater dripped steadily from the porch roof while Jennifer stared at her son like he had betrayed her personally. And in that moment, standing beneath my own porch light with my grandson shaking beside me, I realized this situation was no longer just emotionally unhealthy. It was beginning to break him. After Ethan showed up at my house that night, something shifted inside David. I could see it in the way he stopped automatically defending Jennifer every time tension surfaced. For years he had survived their marriage by avoiding conflict, smoothing over uncomfortable moments, pretending exhaustion at work explained everything happening at home. But seeing his son soaked from rain and trembling on my porch had cracked something open that could not easily be closed again. 2 days later, David called me during his lunch break. His voice sounded lower than usual. "The school counselor wants to meet with us tomorrow," he said quietly. "Apparently Ethan has been having panic episodes during class." I closed my eyes immediately. "David." "I know." The next afternoon, David stopped by my house after the meeting. He looked emotionally drained in a way I had never seen before. He sat at my kitchen table staring at his untouched coffee while gray November light filtered through the curtains behind him. "The counselor said Ethan shows signs of chronic anxiety," he admitted finally. "She asked if there have been major stressors at home." I sat across from him silently. David rubbed his hands together slowly. "Jennifer told her Ethan has become manipulative lately, that he acts differently around certain family members." He could not even look at me while saying it. "And what did the counselor say?" I asked carefully. David let out a bitter laugh under his breath. "She asked why a 10-year-old feels safer emotionally at his grandmother's house than in his own bedroom." Silence settled heavily between us. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past my street while dead leaves scraped along the sidewalk in the wind. Finally, David spoke again. "Mom." She also mentioned something else. His voice lowered further. "Apparently Ethan apologizes constantly at school, even for things that are not his fault." My chest physically hurt hearing that. "Last week another student bumped into him accidentally in the hallway," David continued. "Ethan apologized 5 times. He swallowed hard before adding, "The counselor said children usually do that when they are afraid of upsetting people." For the first time since all this began, David sounded frightened instead of defensive. "Do you think Jennifer is emotionally hurting him?" he asked suddenly. The question stunned me because it was the first honest thing he had said in months. I chose my words carefully. "I think Ethan feels like love in that house depends on performance." David stared down at the table for a very long time. "Jennifer says structure builds strong children. Structure is not the same thing as fear." He looked exhausted hearing that. Before leaving, David hesitated beside the front door. "There is something else," he admitted quietly. "The counselor recommended family therapy." I nodded slowly. "That sounds reasonable." But David shook his head once. Jennifer refused immediately. "Why?" He gave a hollow laugh. "She said therapists encourage weakness and disrespect toward parents." After he left, I stood alone at my kitchen window watching early Christmas decorations flicker across neighboring houses. Somewhere inside that carefully controlled home across town, Jennifer was still convinced she was protecting her son by tightening her grip on him. But the harder she tried to control Ethan emotionally, the more obvious it became that the child was slowly disappearing underneath the pressure. A week before Christmas, David called me close to midnight. I knew something was wrong immediately because my son hated emotional conversations and avoided phone calls after dinner unless absolutely necessary. His voice sounded strained and exhausted. "Mom," he said quietly, "I think you were right." I sat up in bed instantly. What happened? For a few seconds all I heard was his breathing. Then he finally spoke again. "I came home early from work today." Snow tapped lightly against my bedroom window while I listened. "Jennifer did not know I was there," he continued. "I heard them talking upstairs." Something in his tone made my stomach tighten before he even finished the sentence. "David." Ethan was crying. My chest physically ached hearing that. What were they arguing about? Another long silence. "He asked if he could spend Christmas Eve with you for a few hours." I closed my eyes immediately. "And Jennifer said no?" It was worse than that. David sounded shaken now, like he still could not fully process what he had heard. "She told him he needed to stop choosing you over his own mother." Snowplows rumbled faintly somewhere down my street while David kept talking in a low, hollow voice. Ethan kept saying he was not choosing anybody. He just wanted everybody to stop being angry. I pressed my hand against my forehead, already knowing how this must have felt for that little boy trapped between love and loyalty. Then Jennifer told him something I cannot stop hearing in my head. David's voice cracked slightly for the first time in years. "She said if he kept running to you emotionally, eventually people would think something was wrong with their family." I swallowed hard. "David." And then she said maybe he should ask himself why he needs his grandmother so much in the first place. Silence filled the line between us. Finally David whispered, "Mom." He sounded terrified. I could hear movement on his end of the phone, like he was pacing through the house while remembering it. Then Ethan asked her if she even liked him anymore. My eyes filled instantly. What did she say? David let out a painful breath. She told him love is not supposed to feel comfortable all the time. I stared into the darkness of my bedroom while tears burned behind my eyes. Somewhere across town, my grandson had apparently learned to associate love with tension, performance, and fear of disappointing people. David spoke again before I could answer. After that, I heard him say something that made me feel sick. His voice lowered to almost nothing. He told Jennifer he wished he could live somewhere nobody was disappointed in him all the time. Neither of us spoke for several seconds after that. Finally David admitted the truth he had spent months avoiding. "Mom, I think Ethan is scared of his own mother." The next morning, Jennifer sent a family group message about Christmas dinner plans like nothing had happened. Formal, organized, perfectly written. But underneath every polite sentence now, all I could hear was a frightened little boy asking whether someone still liked him after failing to be perfect. Christmas Eve arrived with freezing rain and gray skies that turned the entire neighborhood silver. I spent most of the afternoon baking cinnamon rolls Ethan used to help me make every December when he was younger. Back then he would stand on a kitchen chair wearing pajamas with snowmen on them, while accidentally spilling flour everywhere, and laughing so hard he could barely breathe. That memory felt painfully distant now. Around 4:30, David showed up at my front door alone. The second I opened it, I knew something had happened. He looked emotionally wrecked. His hair was damp from rain, and he held his car keys so tightly they pressed marks into his palm. "Where is Ethan?" I asked immediately. "At home with Jennifer." His voice sounded hollow. I stepped aside so he could come in. He did not even remove his coat before speaking again. "Mom, I heard a recording." My stomach tightened instantly. What kind of recording? David sat heavily at the kitchen table and stared at the floor for several seconds before answering. Ethan records voice notes sometimes on his tablet. The school counselor suggested it because writing his feelings down made him anxious. He swallowed hard. "I found one from last week." Rain tapped steadily against the windows while Christmas music played softly from a neighbor's house somewhere outside. David finally looked up at me, and I realized he had been crying. Jennifer did not know he was recording. My chest already hurt before hearing another word. What was on it? David rubbed both hands over his face slowly. Ethan was crying because he forgot to put one of his school binders back in the correct drawer. He paused again. Jennifer kept asking him why simple instructions were so difficult for him. I sat down across from him carefully. "That does not sound good," I whispered. "It gets worse." His voice cracked. At one point she told him maybe the reason he acts weak all the time is because certain people treat him like a victim instead of teaching responsibility. He did not need to say my name. We both knew who she meant. Then Ethan asked if she was mad at him forever. The room felt unbearably quiet after that. David stared blankly toward my Christmas tree glowing softly in the corner of the living room. "Mom," he sounded terrified of disappointing her. I closed my eyes briefly. Children are not supposed to feel emotionally unsafe in their own homes. David nodded slowly, almost like he hated himself for finally understanding that truth. "I confronted Jennifer tonight," he admitted. "And..." A bitter laugh escaped him. "She said I was becoming emotionally manipulated too." I felt exhaustion settle deep into my bones hearing that. Jennifer still genuinely believed love meant pressure, control, perfection, obedience. And now anyone who questioned her methods automatically became the enemy. David looked at me again with tears still sitting in his eyes. "She actually said you poisoned Ethan against her by making him too emotionally comfortable." For a long moment neither of us spoke. Finally I asked quietly, "What are you going to do?" David stared down at the floor before answering in a voice barely above a whisper. "For the first time in months, I think I finally believe my son." By the middle of January, the house across town no longer looked perfect from the outside. David had finally insisted on family counseling despite Jennifer's resistance, and for the first time since all this began, somebody other than me was saying out loud that Ethan's anxiety was not normal childhood behavior. Jennifer hated it, not because she hated her son, but because every conversation forced her to confront something she had spent years avoiding. Control was not the same thing as care. The changes happened slowly after that. There was no dramatic screaming match. No explosive ending. Just small uncomfortable truths surfacing one after another until nobody could pretend anymore. David started spending more one-on-one time with Ethan. The counselor encouraged unstructured bonding, which Jennifer openly mocked at first. But within weeks, Ethan began laughing more around his father. He stopped apologizing every few minutes. He even started sleeping through the night again without stomach aches before school. Jennifer noticed all of it, though she rarely admitted it aloud. One Saturday afternoon in early February, David brought Ethan over to my house while Jennifer attended a work conference downtown. Snow still covered parts of my front lawn, melting slowly beneath pale winter sunlight. Ethan sat at my kitchen counter eating tomato soup and grilled cheese while telling me about a science project involving volcanoes. Halfway through the story, he accidentally dropped half his sandwich onto the floor. The room went quiet for one split second out of habit. Then Ethan looked at me nervously like he was waiting for disappointment to arrive. Instead, I grabbed a paper towel and smiled gently. 5-second rule, I said. Ethan blinked. Then something unexpected happened. He laughed. Not the careful little laugh I had become used to over the past year. A real laugh. Loud. Uncontrolled. Childish. David looked up from the coffee mug in his hands and stared at his son for several seconds without speaking. I think it shocked him to realize how rarely that sound existed in their house anymore. Later that afternoon, while Ethan worked on his volcano model at my dining table, David stood quietly beside me near the kitchen sink. "I owe you an apology," he said softly. I shook my head immediately. "You were trying to hold your family together." "No," he replied. "I was trying to avoid conflict while my son slowly disappeared." The honesty in his voice hurt almost as much as the months that came before it. He looked toward Ethan carefully before speaking again. "The counselor said something last week I cannot stop thinking about." "What was that?" David swallowed hard. "She said emotionally safe children do not panic over spilled drinks." Silence settled gently around us while snowmelt dripped steadily from the edge of the roof outside. Across the room, Ethan looked up from his project and smiled at me without fear for the first time in months. Not because his life had become perfect. Not because all the damage had magically disappeared. But because somebody had finally listened when a little boy tried to explain that love should not feel like walking on broken glass. Jennifer still struggled with letting go of control even months later. Some people spend so long believing perfection equals love that they do not recognize tenderness when they see it. But little by little, the house grew quieter in a different way now. Softer. And every Sunday afternoon, Ethan still came over to help me bake cinnamon rolls while flour covered my countertops, and nobody treated mistakes like emergencies anymore.